Okay. Okay. All right. So my topic for today is what's called Tisha in Mantua. It's the story of a tragedy that occurred in an Italian city called Mantua. It's north of Italy in this region called Lombardy. And it's a tragedy that is not very talked about at all. There's very little information about it online. And because in the history of Jewish people, a tragedy of 400 years ago is okay. It's been buried by fresher wounds and bigger tragedies, unfortunately. Nonetheless, I feel like the story hasn't been told really anywhere, and it's so I feel like almost like we'll see there's a rich heritage in this small city of Mantua. I mean, it's not even that so small, but it was a very significant city. It was ruled by the Gonzaga dynasty, which were big spenders. Even today, the ducal palace of Mantua is like the 6th largest in the world. They were big spenders. They were big gamblers. First of all, in general, northern Italy had a big gambling problem, even amongst the Jews. Okay, but anyways, so this incredible heritage in this city of about, at the time that we're talking about, 1630, had about 3,000 Jews living in Mantua. Now, it might not sound like a lot, but for those days, probably one of the biggest communities in the world, because Venice, which had the biggest community in Italy altogether, had about 5,000 to 6,000 people, okay, at that same time. So 3,000 is considered quite large, okay? Besides that, and we'll see, it is a massive heritage, a massive wealth of Torah scholarship, and not just Torah scholarship, a massive wealth of colorful Jewish personalities that were unique, that never repeated before or after. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And then what happens, so the way I come to this is I wasn't really looking at it. 1630 is famous in Italian history for something else. It's famous for the Black Plague that occurred in 1630. And it really, this plague occurred in 1630 as a result of this event that we're describing, which is called the War of the Mantuan Succession. What basically happens that in 1628, the last duke of the direct dynasty of Gonzagas dies, right? And he doesn't have a male heir. And as usually happens when there's no male heir, there's a vacuum, and that vacuum will be filled, okay? So that's called the War of Mantuan Succession. So during the War of Mantuan Succession, it was between two big superpowers, between France and Germany. Germany was called the Holy Roman Empire at the time, right? So these two big superpowers actually started fighting it out over this relatively small duchy in northern Italy, because it had a significance in monetarily, and also just the way where it was located on a silk route. Okay, because Mantua was also involved in silk manufacture at the time. Okay, so let's before we get to the actual story, which once I discovered this. Again, it's not like this was hidden anywhere, but it's just not very popular. But basically, somebody by the name of Avraham Masserani or Masserano, different places brought down differently. This Avraham Masserano was one of the leaders of the community. He happened to be away during the siege of Mantua, which we're going to talk about. And when he came back, he was involved in actually getting things, putting things together again. And so this Avraham Masserani was asked by the leaders of the community, the Rabbonim, to compose an account of the events. And that's what he did. And we have something called Sefer Hagalus Vehapedus, which he published 4 years later in 1634 in Venice. Okay. And also besides that, he also composed the Kina in memory of this tragic event. By the way, I have handouts here that you should take a look. Okay, so on page 1 of the handout, on the cover, and the people who are watching at home on the Zoom, the cover screen, you see a 1575 map of Mantua, right? It's this city surrounded by these lakes. These are man-made lakes. And around Mantua is a river called Po, okay? And so what's interesting, you'll find on the printing press, there was, again, we'll see in a second, that Mantua had a long tradition of printing, originating almost from the dawn of printing in 1475. And Mantua, always on the cover of their books, when it says printed Po Mantua. So Po, I think it's a play on words. Po in Hebrew means, here. And Po, the river, Po Mantua. Okay. So, but this is the map. So surrounded by these lakes, therefore it's kind of, it's not an easy city to conquer. Okay. It's not an easy city to conquer because you got to get through one of these bridges. Okay. And then you could see also just on the next page, you could see, for the people that are here, on the next page, you could see a larger map of North Italy, the way it was at that time, right? You have, so what you see over here is very important, is that Mantua, the Duchy of Mantua, which is run by these Gonzagas, they're called the Dukes of Mantua and Monferrato. And you will see on the map that Mantua and Monferrato are actually not next to each other, okay? Because Monferrato, they got through marriage, okay? All right, so let's get to it. So before I get into the tragedy, I just want to give a little bit of a background to the development of the community, okay? And basically, the community started quite early on, all the way even before the Spanish expulsion. So all the way in the 15th century, in the 1400s, there were two people that I want to mention. So first of all, let's start with the printing, actually. So this one, for the people that are watching online, you see this is the Sefer Hagalus Vehapedus that's written by the Avraham Masserani. Okay, so here are some of the printings that were printed in Mantua. Again, so there was this person by the name of Avraham Colorni, and his wife Estelina. They both together, it was a husband and wife team, they set up a printing shop in 1475. Okay, and it was one of the, you understand that these early printing shops are like very rare. These were like the early adopters, right? Jews in general were the early adopters of the printing technology. And you think about it, nothing changed the world as much as the creation of printing, right? And in the early times, since most of the Europe was illiterate, only the nobles would be able to to afford and to read books, and also Jews, because Jews needed to Torah study, prayers, right? So Jews were one of the earliest people to get involved in this printing business. On the other hand, soon after they did get involved, they were actually prohibited from owning printing presses. So only Christians. So it used to be always a partnership between a Jew and a Christian, who Christian would be the owner, and the Jew would be the typesetter, and the guy who would figure out what would sell, what wouldn't sell, etc. So this is so if you can see on page 4 in the handout and on the screen, right? You could see that kind of interesting design of lettering. That is the last page of the Tur Orach Chaim. That's this one over here. This page over here. That's the last page of the Tur Orach Chaim that was printed in Mantua in 1476. Okay, and his print. This is printing. It looks almost like Sapphiros, but it's actually printed. Okay, so that's number one. So besides that, in the 1400s, there were these massive Gaonim, and I'm just going to mention two of them, two of the Gaonim. The one that is in the secular world, the one that's famous is Rabbi Yehudah Messer Leon. Rabbi Yehudah Messer Leon was a Chacham HaKoilel, they called him. Right, he was a man of wonder. He knew everything. He was a graduate of the medical school, which was also something unique in Italy, in northern Italy, in Padua, which was part of the Republic of Venice. Jews were allowed to select like super bright superstars. Jews and were allowed to participate in the medical school in Padua. So Rabbi Yehudah Messer Leon was a doctor. He was also later given the title of Doctor of Philosophy. He wrote in Latin and Greek, and he wrote philosophy, and he wrote, but he's kind of, a lot of these books are not even longer with us. The one that is remembered is called Neifes Sufim. Neifes Sufim is a book on rhetoric, right? A book on English language, but based on early Latin and Greek scholarship. Okay, and it was published also in this same printing house. In this printing house of Avraham Kanat printing house in Mantua was published this first book, Neifes Sufim, and it has the privilege of being the first book to be published in the lifetime of the author, right? So that's, again, this is new things that are happening, and it's happening right here in this place called Mantua. But the biggest, and some say he was the one that really kind of made Mantua what it is, the biggest superstar for Mantua in the 1400s, in the 15th century, is actually somebody by the name of Maharik. Okay, Maharik stands for Rabbi Yoseph Colon. Maharik stands for Rabbi Yoseph Colon. Now, the reason why Mantua really began to develop is that some of the Ashkenazim, and by the way, Ashkenazim is going to, for this, at some point in this talk, Ashkenazim is going to become a very bad word, because in the chronicle, right, he calls the Germans who are going to be attacking the city of Mantua, he calls them Ashkenazim. Okay, so that's because that's what they are, Ashkenazim. But Ashkenazim, when I'm saying Ashkenazim now, I mean Ashkenazi Jews are escaping from certain persecutions in little towns that are just north of Italy, and they're slowly settling in Mantua. So in the 1400s, there's maybe about 200 Jews living in Mantua. Okay, and one of them, they bring in this super duper massive talent, and that is Rabbi Yoseph Colon. Rabbi Yoseph Colon started to, again, also he was born somewhere in like Piedmont area, maybe even north, and then he came down. And even though right away he was recognized as this huge genius, he supported himself by being a tutor for like the wealthy families, but slowly and surely he developed a circle of Talmidim around him, that all of them are going to become these superstar of Ashkenazi Jewry. And then eventually he was given a position to be a Rav in Mantua, and he became the Rav of Mantua. And there he developed his yeshiva that had this style of learning called Aliba de Hilchasa, right? And that's why if you open up the Beis Yosef, if you open up the Shulchan Aruch, there is, his shilas and shuvas, his questions and answers, his psakim are mentioned all throughout. There's just he was just like this superstar. And again, he kind of blossomed fully in this place called Mantua, and some say that it's because of his stature and because of his Torah scholarship that really Mantua began to grow into what it would become. Okay, for example, this thing that we light Hanukkah candles, right? The new candle first, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the way we position it, that really comes from this Maharik Colon. There were other ways to do it, and Rabbi Yosef quotes him as that. That's why he's following him. Okay. Anyways, now the Jews did not live in the ghetto. The Jews lived in Mantua with everybody else until 1612, and we'll get there in a second. In the 1500s, in the 16th century, again, there were other huge Talmidei Chachamim there. I just mentioned two. I'll mention two. One is Rav Moshe Provinciali. Rav Moshe Provinciali, again, people look, it's not mentioned. He happens to be, he had his own textbook, published his own textbook in geometry, and he also published his own Shalas and Chuvas, and there was also a major get controversy in northern Italy at the time, and he was like the big opinion on this get controversy. There was almost like a worldwide machlokes. And again, there's a sefer called this Zeyot Sarishena, and that's part of his that's his psak on this get, amongst other things. Okay, and the other person that was really famous at the time is Rabbi Yehudah Messer. Again, probably these names, I'm sure probably not, a lot of these names are not so familiar to you, but nonetheless, these are tremendous giants of Torah Jewry. Rabbi Yehudah Messer is famous for his drushes. So in those days, and both amongst the Jews and amongst the Christians, right, there was the Rabbonim, right? The officially positioned Rabbonim that were Rabbonim of shuls or the cities, right? But there were also darshanim, there were also preachers. Same thing with Christians. They had their priests, which were official title people, and then there were these preachers that would walk around and give their sermons, right? So Rabbi Yehudah Messer eventually he would become a Rav too, but he started as a preacher, and his drashas are published. His drashas are published. They were new. The way he made his drashas were totally new for the time, and they were a big thing. Interesting that towards the end of his life, they had an episode where one of the Jews. Okay, let's back up a second. Let's back up for a second, right? And we understand that Jews and Christians living side by side was never like a simple thing. Right? Jews and Christians living side by side, there was a mutually beneficial partnership, right? But there is also constant tension. Sometimes the tension was less, sometimes the tension was more. Jews were, for example, obligated to hear drashas, like lecture sermons from priests in order to try, because they wanted to convert them. Officially, according to church canon, right, Jews are not supposed to be treated too badly, right? You're not supposed to hurt them. That's the official canon. Why? Because they're like, according to this is I believe Saint Augustine's approach is that they have to be a constant reminder to Christians what happens if you don't accept Jesus. In other words, Jews are supposed to live a miserable life, so you could see them. You're not going to accept Jesus. Look at them. The problem is Jews always tend to, come up. They they work hard. They figure out ways to live actually a pretty good life. And so occasionally Christians look at the Jews and say, wait, they're not a reminder of what happens to, they're just the opposite. They're like the reason, they're speaking the opposite. So occasionally they have to then put the Jews down in order to make sure to equilibrate the situation. Anyway, so that's the same thing in Mantua. Gonzagas were not particularly religious people. They actually were quite the opposite. They were known for their what's the word?
Licentiousness.
Let's go with licentiousness. Okay, they were known for their wild expenditures, lavish parties, and all sorts of intrigue and all sorts of problems, and even murder. Okay, they were sinners, to say the least. Nonetheless, they were big supporters of churches, and also they would also establish a 5-year a university, a Jesuit university that would last for exactly 5 years. But at the time, it was like a big breakthrough university of Mantua. But the reason for that is because one of their uncles became a Jesuit. Okay. Anyways, so back to the story. So my point over here is to say that the relationship was not always smooth. So here's an example. So Rabbi Yehudah Messer was very much revered leader of this Mantuan community. And at some point, some young fellow decided that he wants to convert to Christianity. And it was rumored that he changed his mind. And it was rumored that Rabbi Yehudah Messer actually talked him out of it. And now that was a huge crime. Okay, if you prevented somebody from actually converted to Christianity, that would be a terrible crime. And they arrested him and 2 other leaders of the community, and they tortured them for a long time. And they had these special commissions set up, and they would preach to them and try to convince them, and under duress, constantly, like 24/7 types of propaganda. And let me just read to you for a second so the Gonzaga, the Duke himself, this is at that time was Duke Guglielmo, he was very much interested in getting this Jew converted. And in the end, so he sent his right-hand man, the governor, to go get a report on what's going on in the conversion process. And the governor came back with something like that the priests say that this Jew alone can sustain the whole synagogue. He's an obstinate Jew, and that he's a wise sage, and that there is nothing, there's nothing we can do about him. And then eventually they let him go. The other two, they were able to actually convert into Catholicism, but him, they eventually let him go. Anyways, other times, but otherwise, most Gonzagas couldn't care less. Really, there was economic benefit to Jews in Mantua, especially for the Duke, because you can tax them, and they can't get anything in return. And they were involved in major industries, including banking, including the silk manufacture, including money lending, and all sorts of goldsmiths and other craftsmen. So they were a very productive part of Mantua. Like I said, 3,000 people, which is also about 8% of the population. Again, it's a pretty large amount, 8% of the population. But besides, again, the Torah scholars and the scholars, there were mentioned three very, very unique, I would say, very unique Jews for that time and probably for all time. Okay, and I'll start with this one. Okay, his name is Avraham Colorni, and you may have something about him on page 3, I think, actually, of the handout. Okay, so they called him, and I Rabbi Schneider, I'm going to need your help over here. Okay, that. They called him a Grossen Judenkünstler. What does that mean? That means a great Jewish artist or a craftsman or something along those lines. Okay, so that's what that's what he called. Some people called him professor of secrets. Some people called him an evil-minded genius. Okay, especially when he was in a place called Stuttgart, where he was like towards the end of his life. He was there for a little bit. But what was he? So he was an engineer. He was a designer of weapons. He was a cryptographer. He published a book on the theory of cryptography. Okay, and at that time, a Catholic priest by the name of Tommaso Garzoni, okay, wrote a book called. He decided to write a book which was very popular at the time, a book on all the professions in the world. Okay, he went ahead and listed and described all the professions that you could possibly choose at that time. Okay, and that book starts out with a sonnet that he composed in honor of this Avraham Colorni, this Orthodox Jew, who was this mystery of a person. And today you'll see, if you Google his name in these interesting circles, you'll find a lot of I saw even in Italian. Somebody wrote a book and a biography about him called, again, I can't say in Italian, but something to Dio. It's like magician of God or something like that. Anyway, so he, at a young age, in his early 20s, he was born in Mantua, and in his early 20s, he was in the service of the Gonzagas, and his purpose was he would design all sorts of weapons for them. Okay. That's what he would do. He was a designer of not only just weapons, we're talking about different, ways to hurl, weapons, machinery. Some say that he even designed like a revolver, a 10-chamber revolver. Okay, but his reputation grew worldwide, so much so that at some point, Rudolph II. Who is Rudolph II? Rudolph II is the end of the 1500s. Rudolph II was the Holy Roman Emperor, right? He was the guy, by the way, that met at some point with Maharal of Prague. He was very interested in this sort of mysterious, Kabbalistic types of stuff. And Rudolph II moved the capital of the Holy Roman Empire from Vienna to Prague, because Prague had that reputation of, and we talked about this a couple of years ago when we talked about Rabbi Yom Tov Lippmann-Heller, who was at that time in Prague. So Rudolph II heard about this Avraham Colorni, and somebody kidnapped his brother at the time. And by this time, this Avraham Colorni had a reputation of being an escapologist, an escape artist, that he got a reputation he could escape from any place in the world. And so they hired this guy, this Jew, Avraham Colorni, to go to Poland, I think it was in Poland, and try to release to help this brother escape of the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay, happens to be so. By the time he got there, they already reached a deal, and they didn't need his services. But for the next 10 years, he was in the service of Rudolf II, this Avraham Colorni. Okay, and over there, he was mainly working on cheaper and more efficient production of saltpeter. Saltpeter is the main ingredient in gunpowder. Okay, I don't know if you know how gunpowder was produced in the 1600s, but it took a very long time to produce, and it was very difficult to produce in large quantities. Eventually afterwards he went to Stuttgart. Over there, they was supposed to be starting a major venture, and I don't want to get into it. The venture didn't work out. He was actually arrested. He was kept in the house arrest, and lo and behold, poof, one day he disappeared. And they found him a year later in Mantua. Anyways, so that's Avraham Colorni. The other two Jews very famous at this time is, first of all, Mantua. The other thing that it was famous for in the non-Jewish world is music. Music. It's considered one of the early the early birthplaces of opera. Okay, Monteverdi, who is a big opera name, is from Mantua, and at that time Salamone Rossi. Salamone Rossi. I don't know if you ever heard of this name. Actually, again, if you Google on YouTube, you'll see that he's considered to be, because classical music, right? You've heard of Vivaldi, yes? Right? What country is Vivaldi in? Italy, right? Vivaldi, that's why he's got an Italian last name, right? So Vivaldi. But he is a very early classical musician, right? He's like also in the 1600s, right? Most of the classical music that we're familiar with is after Vivaldi, like the Germans, the Polish, the Russians. That's a post-Vivaldi era, right? So these early musicians, because the music changed right about the time of Vivaldi, music changed. And Salamone Rossi, who was even just a little bit before Vivaldi, was one of these key figures, these key composers that were involved in the transition of the music. Was called polyphonic, where there was these multiple voices playing at the same time, versus harmonic, where like what we listen to, which is harmony and stuff like that. So again, so he published a book. Again, if you see on the handout, let's see, if you see the handout, right, same page, you see he published a book called Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, right? Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, right, which is a play on the pasuk of Shir Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, right, because his name was Shlomo. And he published this book, where in this book, Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, he published his notes. As you can see, again, if you could see in that little picture, you could see that these are like early notations, right? Which is in it's music for the synagogue, meaning he has the music for Kaddish, for Aleinu, for all sorts of services, and they played that music. Okay, and one other person who was really before this time that I want to mention to you is a gentleman by the name of Leone de Sommi, or Yehudah Ben Ephraim, I think was his name. De Sommi, he was from a famous Portaleone family of Italy, and he wrote the first book in the history of the world, not just Jews, on stagecraft, on how to properly set up stage and theater for most dramatic effect, how to set up the lighting, how to do all of these things. He was the person who did it. He was also a playwright, a production. He had his own theater. He was so famous in the Mantuan court that they invited him to join this exclusive academy called Academia de something in Degliti or something like that, that was exclusively for like knights and nobles. And they unofficially kind of snuck him in. They weren't allowed to put him in officially because he wasn't a Christian, but unofficially they made him a secretary of this academy. So then he was part of it. he was so famous and so, again, had such a rock star, super status, that he was excused from wearing the Jew badge. He was just given all the privileges. Nonetheless, and they also tried to convert him many times. Nonetheless, he would not, do his plays on Shabbos. He would not do his plays on Yom Tov, and no matter how many times they tried to convert him, he would hold strong. Okay. Anyways, all of this is to say is that there's a wealth of culture, both Jewish and non-Jewish. The Jews are, what's the word? They're like worldly, right? They have to be both connected on the Jewish level, a massive scholarship, but at the same time also they are involved in the world. But what happened. One other thing I'll mention in 1602, talking about these preachers, right? We're talking about the time period that we're speaking about is in the heat of Counter-Reformation, right? Counter-Reformation means the Catholic Church was fighting against the Protestant Reformation, right? And as a result, especially in Italy, because of the Counter-Reformation, again, it's the same idea. Hey, we're fighting against the Protestants. Why? Because the Protestants, we consider them heretic. But look, we got these Jews over here. They're also not exactly following our ways. So what do? Right? So this is when all of the kind of the decrees, and we spoke about was it 2 years ago, we spoke about Ancona, which was really a product of the same spirit of the times, right? So there were these preachers who were zealous, who go around and they would stoke these flames of anti-Semitism. And so one such preacher showed up in Mantua in 1602, and he spoke in the church about, and again, he complained, how is it that Jews and Christians are living together side by side when you see Venice already has a ghetto from 1516, right? And then the next day, which was on Shabbos, and the next day when Jews, were in their synagogues on Shabbos, and it seems that they were having a good time in front of the synagogue, but somebody rumored saying, look, they're making fun of the priest. They're making fun of the priest who spoke yesterday in the church. And so the next Saturday or Sunday, when he was giving his drasha, he said, oh, look, we were allowing these Jews not only to live among us, we're allowing them to even make fun of us. So at that point, there were major arrests, and 7 Jews were arrested. They were dragged through the street on the horses. They were hung upside down, and they were executed. So it was a terrible moment. And from that point on, the tensions were very, very rough. And by 10 years later, the Jews were already put into the ghetto. In 1612, the Jews were all forced into a ghetto. In the ghetto, they had 8 shuls in the Mantuan ghetto. Fine. Now, finally, we get to this is just background information. And finally, we get to our story. We'll call the Milchama and the Magefa. The Milchama and the Magefa. So like I said before, so you have here, just again, I'm not going to go into all the details of the Gonzagan dynasty, but you could see over here on this paper, right, a kind of a list of all of the dukes. Not all of them have a picture, only kind of the main ones. But you will see, so the first Duke of Gonzaga is Federico II. He was made Duke by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, which means that Mantua was really like a tributary of the Holy Roman Empire, right? And throughout this whole time, it's an independent duchy, but it's part of the Holy Roman Empire, okay? So really every new Duke needs to get what's called investiture, or like he calls them investitura. That's what he says in the chronicle. Anyway, so as you can see, so you have all these dukes, and they have the other 2 lines. Okay, you have the Louis Gonzaga. He was the Duke of Nevers, which is a French territory, and you have Ferrante as the first Count of Guastalla, which is another small duchy in northern Italy. also part of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so what happens is that when the last duke, which is Vincenzo II, which doesn't have a picture, it's that last square on the bottom. When Vincenzo II dies in 1628, right, he has no children. And so there are two possible, so to speak, cousins that can take the throne. You have the line, the Carlos or Charles, Duke of Nevers, that's from France. And you have Ferrante from Guastalla from northern Italy. Okay. The problem is, if the Duke of Nevers takes the throne, then Mantua becomes part of France, and it switches from Holy Roman Empire to France. And Ferdinand II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, did not want to let that happen, even though he himself is involved in one of the greatest or biggest, most terrible wars in history, known as the 30 Years' War. So this War of Mantuan Succession, which was really like a side war in this big picture, is known as the 30 Years' War. And again, you will find very little information on it. It's a 2-year, lasts about 2-3 years. It's a small war, but it technically has massive consequences, because as a result of him sending troops to battle to conquer Mantua, he made himself more weak in the home base in Germany. And at that time, that allowed the Swedes, Gustavus Adolphus, to come in from Sweden. And that's when really the 30 Years' War really became what it became. Okay, so that diversion of troops, and most of the time, the Holy Roman Empire used mercenary troops known as the Lenzknecht. Again, if you ever heard of Lenzknecht, they were these brutal mercenaries. They were army for hire. And so he gathered a large force of these Landsknecht, and he sent them down to Mantua in order to conquer Mantua, and also was Monferrato. Now there's a third person on the scene, and that's also, you can see on this picture, all the way on the right side, you have this guy, Charles Emmanuel, Duke of Savoy. How does he come into the picture? Well, as you saw on the map, Montferrat is away from Mantua, and it's closer to Savoy. It's right on the border of Savoy. So this guy, Charles Emmanuel, decides that he's going to use this as an opportunity to get Montferrat for himself. And he's not coming from the side. He is related. He's actually the father-in-law of Francesco IV. Okay, Francesco IV. That's another little square. Okay. He lived for a very short. He reigned for a very, very short time, but just enough, to marry the daughter of the Duke of Savoy, and also to have a daughter. Her name is Maria. She's also going to play a role here. So what happens is, okay, all right. So now we get to our main story, which comes from this chronicle of Sefer Hagalus Vehapedus by Avraham Masserani. And he says that the Duke of Nevers, this Carlo Gonzaga, shows up in 1628 in plain clothes, secretly kind of comes to Mantua, and slowly begins to make himself popular there. At some point, he says, he was walking in the streets, and the populace started screaming, "Long live Duke Carlos." And he got very scared by that. Why? Because he's not allowed to call himself Duke until the Holy Roman Emperor gives his okay. And he didn't, and he knows they probably is not going to get the okay from the Holy Roman Emperor because he's French. So he sends his bodyguards to go beat the people up. While he sends the guards to beat the people up, the people of the town assume that he's actually he's allowing non-Jews to go beat the Jews. Why would they think that? Because right before that happened, the Jewish leaders came to show their respect, and they brought him a gift, and to say that, well, we welcome you, everything's okay, because that's what they have to do. Otherwise, they can have trouble for themselves. And so all of a sudden, there was this it was a minor outbreak of a pogrom that happened right when this duke came. But soon they were able to close the gates of the ghetto. Nobody really got hurt. There was some minor damage. One person almost got beaten up, but technically, in the beginning of this phase, they were able to rectify the situation. He said, "No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any Jew to get hurt." And then he made a declaration that Jews are okay and everything's going to be okay. Okay, they tried soon to get the Holy Roman Emperor to agree to his becoming a duke, but it wasn't going to happen. And what he did was he married his son, who's also Charles, also Carlo. So we got Carlo, who's got a son named Carlo. He married his son off to this daughter Maria from the other Gonzaga line. This way he says, before anybody says no, I'm going to have this seal, right? And that was, and the Spanish got very upset by this because Spain and Holy Roman Empire is from the same family. Again, I want to get into it. They're the same people. And so that's how the War of Mantuan Succession begins. And you have the German troops coming down to attack it. Meanwhile, also next to Mantua is also, by the way, the Duchy of Milan. Milan is aligned with the Spaniards. It's part of the Spanish Empire. And so they're becoming like the home base for the German troops and the Spanish troops. And on the side, and he's trying to gather like French support, as well as the Republic of Venice sends him support as well. And so begins the war. The Germans split their troops into two halves. One half to attack Mantua, and the other attack to attack Montferrat. In Montferrat, there's a massive fortress. The main city of Montferrat is called Casale, and it has because it's called a castle. It's as a super fortified city, and they make a siege around it. They try this general, another general, and everyone fails, and they cannot conquer Montferrat. But they come to Mantua, and initially also they cannot conquer Mantua, but they siege it, right? They siege it. They create a siege around it, around this. Again, this place, right? So they can't go anywhere. But meanwhile, before they knew that there was going to be a siege, so they brought in as much produce and as much cattle as possible. Avraham Masserani writes that that they brought in the cattle, but they forgot to bring, or they did not forget, but they did not think they would need to bring sufficient amount of straw for the cattle, because they didn't think the siege is going to really last for a long time. So they brought in all the cattle, but not enough straw, so that at some point they just had to slaughter all of, a lot of these cattle because they couldn't sustain it. And so there was plenty during the siege. He said there was plenty of food and there was plenty of meat, and everything seemed to be doing okay. But like I said, what the Landsknecht bring with them to Mantua, besides their sword, is the plague. Okay, they brought with them this massive plague, and the plague initially, the plague was only by the Germans, and it didn't get into the city because the city was under siege, right? But somehow people were sneaking in and out. Somehow the plague got through the walled city, and before you know it, it was going around Mantua as well. And he records that initially 3 Jews would die per day. At some point, he says 20 Jews would start dying each day. Okay, and so you have this. So in what they're locked in this siege, and now they're suffering through this plague. For some reason, again, I don't know how, but on the 5th of Av, so the plague started, he says, about Nisan time, and on the 5th of Av, they felt that the plague was over. I don't know how that this plague suddenly stopped, because he says that there are still people, the Black Death is called the Black Death because people are covered with these black buboes, as they call it. Right? It's called the bubonic plague. You have these black marks. And on the 5th of Av, he says the plague finished. If you look at the numbers, let me see. I mean, the plague is going to continue even after the War of Mantuan Succession will be over, the plague is going to continue doing its part. If you look at page, I don't know what page number it is, but you can see the map where the plague struck, and you should also be able to see, that at some places, like in Padua, actually, it killed off over 50, almost 60% of the population. So it was one of the most massive outbreaks in Italian history. Okay, so finally, then he writes like this. He writes, "Vatechzak hamilchama toras hamilchama v'ha'ir b'matzoyer ad b'yom Tisha b'av yom hamar v'anim harmuchen leparonit." That the siege would continue and would strengthen until the 9th of Av, the day that was Muchen leparonit. And so on the 9th of Av, the Landsknecht were able to break through Mantua, capture this long bridge. Again, if you look at the picture, they were able to figure out a way how to run over this long bridge. Okay, and they broke through the castle. He says that there was also some betrayal involved on some officer in Mantua, but they were able to break through. And then 9th of Av, they just went ahead and started pillaging, because these were mercenary armies. They have been around for 2 years. They were not sufficiently paid by the Holy Roman Empire, and this was finally their moment to get paid. So they went and they, that was their main purpose. They couldn't, they're mercenaries. They couldn't care less who becomes duke. They only care about how much they can pillage from this situation. Okay, so on the 9th of Av is so here, Avraham Masserani sees, right, the plague and the 9th of Av all coming together. So he sees it much more than just, hey, there's a War of Mantuan Succession, and we here on the side. They see it now as a divine punishment, as a direct intervention of God, right? This is not just, okay, we're here, okay? And so okay, so that's what happened. So 9th of Av, they come in, they start pillaging, and for 3 hours, they run to the ghetto. Why they go straight for the ghetto? Because the ghetto, everybody knows, that's where the banking industry is, right? So they go straight for the ghetto and start pillaging and taking. It says they broke into the shuls. They took the anything silver and gold they can find in the synagogues and the houses. And for 3 hours, they were given full reign. After 3 hours, he says, the generals of the army came in. There was a guy by the name of Count Erdlinger. He came in and he says, that's it, no more. Do not touch the Jews, do not harm the Jews, do not pillage the Jews, nothing. Okay? The ghetto is to be locked up. No Jews can be harmed. And the Jews are like, what's going on? Like, well, what makes us special, right? What they didn't, little did they know is that they decided that the generals also felt that they were underpaid, right? And they did not want to share the big prize with their soldiers. So they decided even smarter. Instead of taking possessions away from the Jews, it would be much simpler to take the Jews away from the possessions. So what they did was, 10 days later, on the 19th of Av, they made a proclamation. They made a proclamation that all Jews are expelled from the city. All Jews are expelled from the city. They cannot take any possessions with them, except 3 ducats per person. It's not a small amount of 3 ducats, but it's not a huge amount. 3 ducats per person. And on foot, men, women, children, elderly, Black Death, no Black Death, sick, out, not out of the city and out of all territory of Mantua, the entire duchy. Okay, and in the heat of the summer, not only that, they took 9, then later they added 7 more. They took 16 people, the leaders of the community, men of the community, and they locked them up in jail for whatever reason. They didn't know why. They were just locked up. And then the rest of the community was kicked out after they were given 3 days, and they were kicked out. Okay, and so they didn't realize that this exile was going to be much worse for them than the plague and the war combined. Okay, so they were, because it's, what we don't realize, we think of, Yetzias Mitzrayim, we think of 6 million, 3 million Jews, 600,000 Jews leaving Egypt in an orderly fashion. It's very difficult to just transport men, women, children, elderly. It's not such a simple, it's a complicated logistical problem. And so in the middle of the summer, they were all forced just like that out of the city they couldn't contact anybody. Again, this before phones. They could not make any connections. They were just out and go. No provisions, no nothing. Just 3 ducats and whatever clothing you could wear and out. They were able to, they lobbied for some carriages to transport the elderly and the sick. And even there, they were very unlucky, because as soon as they were on their way out, the first of the carriages, we were probably given like rackety, all these carriages. The first of the carriages broke down, flipped over, and the sick and the elderly that were on top of it fell into the water, and they drowned. And that was just the beginning. So from then on, just everything was just worse and worse. They split up into 2 groups. The one group, because they didn't know where to go, right? One group decided they're just going to go by land and by foot, and to the border. They went to a place called Bozzolo, which is another duchy nearby, and they're just going to walk to it. The other group figured, it'd be easier to get somewhere by boat. So they collected their money and they rented some boats. Okay, so the first group had a very hard time, because they had to walk on foot, again, with men, women, children, elderly, walk on foot for miles, and in the middle of heat without any provisions, and children, are screaming and crying, and it's just terrible. But eventually they get to the Duke of Bozzolo, and somebody on their behalf speaks to him, and he feels bad for them, and he empties out a castle on the border for them. They all get packed in there. They're sleeping on the floors, sleeping on top. It's overcrowded, and they're quarantined, right? By the way, the word quarantine comes from Venice, an Italian word which means 40, because initially, during these outbreaks, they had to be quarantined for 40 days. That's where the word quarantine comes from. So that's for 40 days they were put into this fortress, and some of the villagers nearby had pity on them, so they used to bring them some food and to sustain them. So those Jews made it out pretty much okay. They lost only three Jews died from the first group. Okay, it was very. You think now we're fasting for 1 day and we have a headache and we're hungry. We just don't even realize what kind of situations our people have been throughout history. And that's Mantua. What about Holocaust? I can't even think about it. But we're very fortunate, and we should actually focus on this feeling of hunger, and just realize this is a luxury. This is a luxury to fast once a day, just to see it once a year. To see what it feels like. It's a luxury. The other group, on the other hand, was not very fortunate at all. They rented. They pulled their money. They rented 3 boats. In the panic, everybody rushed into the boats. There was a lot of trampling and confusion. And first of all, kids got separated. Some kids went on this boat. Parents went on this boat. There was a lot of separation. There were also a lot of trampling, and so there were some people died as a result of that. There was not enough air to breathe. Some people were still sick from the Black Death. They still had their black marks, and so it was just awful. And not only that, the Germans, in both groups, by the way, the Germans gave them, or Ashkenazim as they call them, right? They gave them guards to accompany them, because they want to make sure that they get out. These guards were supposed to protect them and make sure that they get out. They actually also robbed them of their money and made off. The other guys, the guys on the boat, the group on the boat, they went down. They went down to the Duke of Mirandola, I believe, to the territories of Mirandola. Again, as you can see it on the map, I don't know if you can see it so well. Those are the two circles, right? If you see the three circles, the circle in the middle is the circle of Mantua, and the two circles on the side are the two places where they travel. The ones with the arrows are the river. That's the river. And the boatmen, at some point also when they were crossing one of the rivers, they said the local duke wants a tax, and again they had to pay. They could together whatever funds they had and pay the tax. And then finally, when they got there, the boatmen rushed everybody off the boats as quickly as possible. And again, it was another trampling, and then another group of people died. And once they got there, the Duke of Mirandola did not want to let them in right away. So they were sleeping on the open fields. And also some villagers would come in, and instead of providing them food, they would promise them to give them food, and they would lure some people away, and then they would rob them or take advantage of them. So this group suffered immensely all the way through like Rosh Hashanah. Eventually, the Duke of Mirandola agreed to host them for a lot of money on credit. So much so that even after the community got back for many years, they were paying off that debt for hosting them. Meanwhile, some of the leaders of the community went to Venice. From Venice, they dispatched a delegation to Vienna to meet with Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, because and tell him what's going on. We're being exiled from the community. We've been there for 250 years, and we were just exiled for no reason. And so they appealed to Ferdinand II, and he issued a decree that they're allowed to return. Okay, they're allowed to return. And by the time they got there, and by the time this happened, and finally they allowed them to return. So in the fall of that same year, a couple of months later, they all came back to Mantua. But I say all, out of the original 3,000, only 1,000 survived. Only 1,000 survived. Okay, so much so that the ghetto the Duke Carlos said, okay, you guys don't need this large ghetto anymore. We're gonna downsize it. They actually tried to kick them off the ghetto, but when they came back, they also came back to nothing. They had nothing. Everything was taken from them. Everything was stolen. They had nothing to rebuild with. So they did try to rebuild over the years, and they did. The community did grow. In the late 1600s and late 17th century, there's going to be another superstar of Kabbalah by the name of Rabbi Moshe Zakut. Moshe Zakut is considered to be one of the primary diffusers or spreaders of Arizal's and Rav Chaim Vital's teachings. Rav Moshe Zakut had a huge circle of these Kabbalim around him, but the Mantuan Jewish community never recovered from this tragedy. It never reached the numbers that it had originally. And so this is one of those things that was completely just decimated a community. And so we see this on the last pages of this handout. I took the Kina, which was printed also like in the 1600s, and hasn't really been reprinted ever since. And I just transcribed it over here. And the way he composed this Kina, and I just want you to appreciate for a second, like Eicha Yoshua Badad, right? We say Eicha Yoshua Badad Ha'ira Bosiyam, right? It's a lament about who? About Yerushalayim, right? What does it mean? It's a lament about Yerushalayim. People have a tendency, for example, if you tell somebody, I don't know, Odessa, right away, they have certain associations. They grew connected with the city. If you tell people in New York, the Jews from New York, it's the place and the populace have a certain intimate connection, right? So people represent themselves and the city that they live in, right? They have this connection of the place, of the city that they live in. So same thing, the Mantuan Jewish community, they had a certain respect and a certain identification with being a Mantuan Jew, right? I'm a Jew from Mantua, right? So when they were exiled, he saw these parallels of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash on the 9th of Av and the exile of the Jews, as well as the destruction of the Mantuan Jewish community on the 9th of Av and the exile of the Jews from there, right? So he composed this kina in a way of a duet of like two people. There's a Toisha of Yerushalayim, a resident of Yerushalayim, and Toisha of Mantua, and the resident of Mantua singing together. I also forgot to mention the Jews called Mantua, in Italian, Mantua is Mantova. So they used to pronounce it Man-tova, the good man, right? Mantova, just like Italia was E, an island, Tal, do, Ya of God. Italia is, the island of the Jew of God. So Mantova was the good man, the good man. Okay, so you have this duet of their kind of, what's the purpose of a duet? The purpose of a duet is to heighten the romance, right? To heighten the feelings of love. Like I sing, you sing. Over here, there's a duet of where Yerushalayim and Mantova singing together. It says, Yachdov narim koil mar v'nis marmar. Let us, raise our voice together, our bitter and embittered voice. Kinim hegev ahi kisoy michmar. And we're gonna wail and moan like a gazelle that was trapped in a snare, right? So you have this duet of Yerushalayim and this city of Mantova. Okay, it's late. I have one more addendum, which maybe I'll say after Mincha. Okay.